What is up, guys? It is Quinn here, and in this video I'm going to be going through some of the top waiver wire targets heading into week 14 of the NFL season. I'm guessing for most of you guys this is going to be the last week of the regular season, and then I'm guessing the fantasy playoffs will be starting in week 15. So this is a good opportunity to look at your roster, potentially pick up a player that you can use as like a fringe start in week 14 or in the fantasy playoffs, or this is an opportunity to potentially, take a high upside swing, pick up a handcuff where if an injury occurs, that's someone that could plug into your lineup as a strong option. So I think, there are going to be some win now pieces, some guys who have some extra upside with injuries. Going through every position, these are going to be players who are available in 50% or more leagues using the ESPN Fantasy Football app. As always, if you enjoy the content, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel. If you guys have any fantasy questions, waiver wire, start, sit, trade advice, I'm guessing trades are done, but maybe not, drop them down below and I will be getting back to every single person. But let's jump into the running backs, and I feel like we have to start it off here with James Cook, who is only owned in 25.4% of leagues. So James Cook is someone who I thought, would probably take over the backfield or at least have a larger role much earlier on in the season. Devin Singletary was always holding him off. It seemed like when he would get decent opportunities, he wouldn't really make the most of it. He would fumble or he would have a drop here and there. And then we see the Bills go out on Thursday Night Football, and James Cook had a very prominent role in this offense. He was out there on 32 snaps, only one less than Devin Singletary's 33. So they were basically splitting like the snaps 50-50, or not 50-50 because Nyheim Hines was getting in there. But, for the RB1 snaps, they were neck and neck. We also saw James Cook have one more carry compared to Singletary. Cook had 14. Devin Singletary had 13. And this wasn't like a situation where it was garbage time. James Cook was just racking up a ton of carries. In the early portions of the game, when the game was still on the line, James Cook was very involved in this offense. He also led the running backs in targets with 6 to Devin Singletary's 2, and then Nyheim Hines also had 2. And then he also led the backfield in routes run over both Devin Singletary and Nyheim Hines. And he also made the most of these opportunities. 14 carries for 64 yards, 6 receptions for 41 yards. So he's kind of emerging as someone who potentially could be a fringe option right now with the opportunity to earn more and more work in this backfield. So he's no longer just some sort of random handcuff. He now may have weekly value, and maybe people have kind of forgotten about it. They saw the Sunday slate of games. He may not be on the top of people's minds, but is definitely someone who I think should be one of, if not the priority pickup this week for fantasy. Now the next running back here is going to be Zonovan Knight. His ownership percentage jumped up from 0% all the way back up to, just up to 37.9%. And in a game with Michael Carter out, we saw Zonovan Knight take 75% of the running back carries. He had the clear-cut early down role. Honestly, I was a little low on Knight this week. I thought even with Carter out, I thought him and J-Rob would split the early downs, and it really didn't play out that way. Zonovan Knight had a really strong role. He also took all 4 of the goal line snaps, and then 40% of the 2-minute drill work. So nothing crazy, but it's good to see that he's not, totally one-dimensional as just like a guy on the ground. Also had a solid receiving usage. So I don't think it's necessarily guaranteed that when Michael Carter comes back, Knight's just going to fall behind Carter. They clearly don't think Carter's like this elite talent. They draft Breece Hall, then Breece Hall goes down. They feel the need to trade for James Robinson. Now, in the same way, you can make the argument that they don't think Zonovan Knight is all that great either because they did still bring in James Robinson. But I think in general, this backfield is still very open. And if you can get someone who's going to lead the backfield, even if it's not a guarantee, that's definitely someone who should be picked up off of waivers. We saw the solid workload without Carter. Maybe he can hold on to it. He looked effective. So definitely someone who should be picked up in over 50% of leagues. Now we're just going to be getting into the handcuffs. And we have to start it off here with Samaje Perine, who somehow is still under 50% owned at 45.7. I'm guessing people, figured Joe Mixon would be back. I definitely assume that also. But Perine is someone who needs to be on your team regardless of whether or not he's starting. In the 3 games that Mixon has been banged up, he has put up 30.2, 19.3, and 21.5 PPR points. So he is one of, if not like the most valuable handcuff in fantasy football. And even though Mixon is likely going to be back this week, taking 2 or 3 games off from a concussion seems pretty unlikely, but he is still going to be a clear-cut like top handcuff here, where if Mixon goes down in week 14, week 15, you have a top 12 running back to plug and play in the fantasy playoffs. And it's also possible with how effective he's been that he could potentially cut into Mixon's workload. Now, I don't think he's going to overtake Mixon as the RB1, but maybe it turns into a 65-35, a 60-40 split, and then maybe he gives you, flex value in decent matchups moving forward. So he definitely should be owned even if Mixon is coming back. Then we have Alexander Mattison, who is owned in 23% of leagues. Same story here. He's one of the best handcuffs. If Dalvin Cook goes down, Alexander Mattison is a borderline top 12 running back. And then I felt like this last spot could have gone to a few different handcuffs. I just threw in Jermichael Hasty here, 12.1% owned, the Travis Etienne handcuff. We got to see his workload with Etienne missing a large portion of the game in week 12. He basically got all the opportunities, so I think he is a very valuable handcuff moving forward, but you can make an argument for a few different handcuffs to throw in there. Now, moving over to the wide receiver position, we've got a lot of the same names on here, the repeat offenders. Starting it off here with Darius Slayton, owned in 33.8% of leagues. It's crazy to me that he is still, sub 35% ownership. He has been a very solid high-end wide receiver 3 in like the second half of games played this season. In his last 6 games, he's averaging 13.8 PPR points per game, and it's not like he's super touchdown dependent or he's being carried by like one huge game. It's been consistent. These are his yardage numbers over that stretch: 58, 66, 95, 86, 63, and 90. Those are impressive numbers there, so I definitely think he needs, some more attention for fantasy. The next wide receiver is going to be Donovan Peoples-Jones, who is owned in 43.8% of leagues. If you guys have been watching my videos, I've been very high on DPJ, and someone who I thought, could be a potential top 24 wide receiver rest of season with Deshaun Watson back. So in the first game with Deshaun Watson, nothing crazy as a pass catcher. 3 targets, 3 receptions, 44 yards. I'd say in general, Deshaun Watson was pretty disappointing. I guess it could have been expected with how long of, a hiatus he had from playing the game. Maybe he will continue to get better, work back into form. I do think he will be improving. We did see DPJ kind of save his fantasy day with a punt return touchdown, so he still gave you decent production, but he's definitely going to need Deshaun Watson to pick it up and return to his, form of like 2 years ago to be a strong fantasy option moving forward. We have my guy Treylon Burks up next, who is, just barely making the cut here, owned in 47.3% of leagues, and he was coming off of back-to-back strong games heading into week 13. He started off the game strong with a great touchdown catch, and then he goes down and he just like doesn't move. Like, he made this crazy catch, took a huge hit, and then you realize like the dude is like unconscious on the ground. So a brutal hit. You obviously hate to see it. Hopefully we're going to be able to see him return soon here. I don't know if like maybe I'm, forgetting previous years, but I feel like we've seen a large number of dudes just get like laid out pretty much unconscious. Tua, Juju, I think there was another receiver, maybe Olave, Burks now. Maybe it's just happening to more high profile players, but I feel like there's definitely been an uptick this year, which is, horrible to see. We did see those guys return, semi soon. So if Burks can be back within the next week or two, I do still think he can provide startable value for the fantasy playoffs. He's been impressive. It sucks to see, his breakout kind of stunted with an injury like that. Now moving over to Michael Gallup, who is owned in 44.4% of leagues. He had his best fantasy game of the season, caught 4 passes for 23 yards and 2 touchdowns. In general for Gallup, the targets have actually been there. Like over the last 5 games, these are his numbers: 6, 7, 4, 8, 7. So nothing crazy, but on a top offense, like those targets as the wide receiver 2 can give you some decent production. He's just going to need to have an uptick in the yardage department. He hasn't been super steady there. Even this game, 4 for 23. If you're not catching 2 touchdowns, that's just not going to be doing much for fantasy. So we'll see if he can improve. Obviously, coming off the ACL, he's going to be a better option in the second half of the season. But we're kind of getting close to the playoffs here, where it's like, if he is going to be startable, he's going to need to start showing it very soon, and not just by scoring 2 touchdowns. I'm going to need to see like a 5 for 80, a 6 for 100, a touchdown in there would be cool. but we need to get the yardage up to actually trust him moving forward. And then the final wide receiver here is going to be OBJ, owned in 33.7% of leagues. Looking like the Giants are the favorite to sign him. Could affect Darius Slayton, Cowboys potentially in the mix also. I think it's a question mark on whether or not, he's even going to be someone you want to be playing in your fantasy lineups, because heading into week 14, maybe he signs before this game. If he's going to be signing week 15, then you're expecting him to come off his second ACL tear and just be an immediate contributor. So the farther and farther he waits until he signs, it seems like the less and less likely that he will be viable for fantasy. But, someone who's worth a speculative ad when the waiver wire is probably going to be pretty gross at the wide receiver position. And then just an honorable mention to Jameson Williams, who is owned in 28.8% of leagues. Honestly, his usage was very disappointing. I was very high on Jameson Williams, not necessarily for this game, but I did think he could be a solid guy, potentially in a few weeks. He only played in 8 snaps. He ran 2 routes. We saw DJ Chark, Reynolds, and Khalif Raymond all run more routes than him. It's a weird spot because it's like if he's healthy and active and ready to go, you would like to think that, he'd be able to compete with those guys. Obviously, talent-wise, he's significantly better than everyone on that offense aside from Amon-Ra. And from a prospect perspective, he was significantly better than Amon-Ra. So I would expect those numbers to improve. They're probably just easing him in. But starting off here at 8 snaps, if he's going to need a few weeks to ease himself in, he's just going to be done in terms of fantasy usage. So I still think he's someone who's rosterable, but I do think you have to feel pretty disappointed in, his dud usage this past week. Now, moving into the quarterbacks, the streaming position for the quarterbacks has really fallen off, with Deshaun Watson coming back, and he's owned in over 50% of leagues. The Jimmy G injury. I only have 2 players to talk about here. Jared Goff, owned in 29.6% of leagues. I think one of the last solid streaming options. He has a good Week 14 matchup against the Vikings. Was, kind of hyped for him with Jameson Williams coming back. We'll see if he does play a bigger role, like I just mentioned. And then also I forgot to mention, some of these other streaming quarterbacks, your Mariotas, your Heinekes, those guys are on bye. So it is really slim pickings here this week. The second and final quarterback is going to be Mike White, who is owned in only 13.4% of leagues. In his 2 starts, he's had back-to-back strong fantasy performances, 24.8 and 17.5 PPR points. Now, he has a pretty tough matchup here in Week 14 against the Bills. Very tough for opposing quarterbacks. But then when you're looking at the fantasy schedule, Lions, Jaguars, Seahawks, those are 3 very solid plus matchups for the quarterback position in fantasy. So maybe you're in a spot where you had a Trey Lance injury, then you're rolling with Jimmy Garoppolo. Now Jimmy Garoppolo's down. I think Mike White is someone you could try to pivot to. I think he could be fringe top 12 guy for the fantasy playoffs if he keeps up his current performance. Obviously, you don't love it, but when you're dealing with injuries at the QB position, sometimes you're just taking the best option available, and that could be Mike White rest of season. I think the tight end position is also pretty slim pickings this week. I've got 3 options. Really would only feel decent about starting 1, maybe 2 of these guys heading into week 14. But we're going to start it off here with my guy Greg Dulcich, owned in 39.1% of leagues. This was a big bounce back game for him. I was very high on him after his first 3 games of the season. I love the usage. I love the production. Then he had back-to-back dud games, was making me look not so great in that take. He had a strong bounce back here, 8 targets, 6 receptions, 85 yards, a strong 81% route participation. Obviously, this is more of a long-term take, but I think with what he's shown so far on an offense that is really bad, limited touchdown opportunities, decently low passing volume, I think it's very impressive what Dulcich has done as a rookie, and I think he'll continue to be like a fringe start at the tight end position. Then we have Evan Ingram, who is owned in 34.9% of leagues, and it seemed like every week I was always talking about how Ingram has this great usage, the route participation is great. It had just been leading to, no production on the football field. He has a decent game, another guy with a bounce back, 7 targets, 5 receptions, 30 yards, and a touchdown. Obviously, getting into the end zone helps. 82% route participation. If you're picking up a tight end off waivers, the options are not going to be great for you. And now moving on to the third tight end. I think I said I only had 3. I actually have 4 for you guys. It is going to be Daniel Bellinger from the Giants. And I probably should have talked about him before Evan Ingram. I think him and Dulcich are in the same area in terms of being decent pickups or streaming options at the tight end position. So he had missed a decent chunk of games with an eye injury. He came back this week, and before his injury, he is someone who was becoming very viable as a streaming tight end. He comes out, basically, came back to the role that he left, had an 83% route participation, which is very solid, was targeted 5 times, only turned it into like 20 something yards, 5 receptions, I think it was 24 yards. But I think he's someone who should be viable moving forward and is probably someone who is going to be on waivers right now. And then the fourth and final tight end, Foster Moreau, owned in only 47.4% of leagues. I say only, that's close to the cutoff. I don't really love him as an option. The route participation was kind of his saving grace, and it fell to 71%. 3 targets, 1 reception, 32 yards. I think, if he's out there and some of these other guys are picked up, he still has some touchdown upside. So if you are super desperate, I guess you could look towards Foster Moreau, in the future. And then for the defenses, I wouldn't say it's a super strong week for streaming. I think there are a few decent ones in here. Starting it off with the Seahawks, owned in 45.6% of leagues, going up against the Panthers. Obviously, you want to be targeting that Panthers offense. Chiefs, owned in 44.6% of leagues. They go up against the Broncos. Broncos offense is historically bad. Raiders, 7.3% ownership, going up against the Rams. Obviously, the Raiders defense hasn't been stellar. Weren't terrible against the Chargers this past Sunday, and then the Rams offense is obviously a unit that's going to struggle. Titans, owned in 28% of leagues, going up against the Jaguars. I'd say in general, the Titans are probably the best defense on here. Jaguars can be a little hit or miss as an offense, but Trevor Lawrence has looked much improved this season. Steelers, owned in 42.9% of leagues. Not exactly, the most star-studded, high-performing unit this year, but going up against the Ravens, potentially without Lamar Jackson, this could be a good matchup here for the Steelers and TJ Watt. But that is going to wrap it up for every position, going through, quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, tight ends, and the defenses. As always, if you guys have any questions, drop them down below. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel. I'll be going through my start sits tomorrow. Thank you guys for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.